Assalamu alaikum, and welcome once again to Islam in Focus. Today's program, inshallah, will be our 16th in our series, Muhammad, may peace be upon him, the last messenger of God. And our 10th on this particular segment, on the coming of Muhammad as foretold by Jesus, may peace be upon him. I'm your host, Rashad Mimishan, here once again from St. Mary's University's Dr. Jamal Badawi. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jamal. Could you give us a summary, please, for the benefit of our viewers, of last week's program?
Last week's program, the 15th in the series, continued with the discussion of St. Barnabas' version of what happened on the issue of crucifixion in his gospel. And in the last week portion, we discussed the explanation as to what happened to Jesus and Judas. And we indicated that Jesus, peace be upon him, instructed Barnabas, according to Barnabas' word in his gospel, to write this truth. And that beyond the few people who saw him with his mother, Jesus, peace be upon him, instructed them to bring other followers to the Mount of Olives. And he explained again to them that it was Judas who died and not him, and warned them that Satan will make every effort to deceive them, and then he was carried to heaven in front of them. And finally we came to the concluding part of the Barnabas Gospel, in which he says or describes how the followers of Jesus scattered around, but he says, as usual, the truth was persecuted, and many people pretended to be disciples, taught things which were contrary to what Jesus taught. In fact, unlike the canonized Gospels, he includes Paul among those who did not teach what Jesus actually taught. The story of the crucifixion was not the only thing that mentioned something also about the coming of Prophet Muhammad to clear or clarify this confusion, according to Barnabas. But we made reference to other chapters also, especially 39 and 41, which describes what happened with Adam, and that he was told in advance about the coming of his son, Prophet Muhammad, at the end of the time. In chapter 43, how Barnabas resolves the problem about whose lineage is that person, and he indicated he was from the lineage of Ishmael, not David. In chapter 44, he resolves the dilemma that we find in the canonized Bible about the son of sacrifice, that the only son obviously was Ishmael and not Isaac. So this was essentially the our review in the last time, and that seems to indicate that those who were critical of the Gospel of Barnabas and tried to dismiss it as a forgery perhaps did not have a very good reason for that. There is something there actually that deserves some analysis and further reflections.
Now, apparently there are some objections to the Gospel of Barnabas.
Yeah.
Maybe you can elaborate on what these are, and at the same time give your response to them.
Let me begin with two common objections, then we move on. The first objection is that it says that this could not be a genuine gospel written by St. Barnabas, who was very close to Jesus, peace be upon him. Why? Because some critics say that in that gospel, Paul is very much opposed, and they say how come? Because actually Paul and Barnabas worked together. It was Barnabas who introduced even Paul to the disciples to accept. They went together in missionary work, and they keep referring to the book of Acts in particular to show that they were working together. So how come this could be really the author of that gospel if he differs and is critical of Barnabas? In response to that, I think there are a number of points that should be kept in mind. Number one, the basic source of information about Barnabas and his relationship to Paul is primarily derived from the book of Acts. And the book of Acts, according to biblical scholars, was written by Luke, who was the personal physician of Paul. And obviously he was very close to him, and he had every reason to vindicate Paul and write it in such a way that, he magnifies the importance of Paul. That's why we find that after that, the mention of Barnabas disappears from history. Another point to remember also is that while Barnabas defended Paul in the beginning, when the disciples were skeptical about his sincerity and his claim of conversion, that does not necessarily mean an advance approval on the part of Barnabas of everything that Paul is going to do or say in the future. People change also as time goes on. A third point to keep in mind also is that the very same book, the book of Acts, while it showed the times when Barnabas and Paul apparently worked together, but the same book also shows that they split. And the reason, as we indicated before, is not very convincing. There must have been a deep-rooted reason why they didn't see eye to eye. In fact, as late as today, I was checking some recent references, and I believe it was Encyclopedia Americana in the 1981 edition under Barnabas. And for the first time, I have seen an acknowledgement by scholars that the difference between Paul and Barnabas were serious, quite serious, just beyond what is mentioned in the book of Acts. And that's only reasonable why these two towering figures differed with each other. Another point to remember also is that there's a great deal of mystery, as indicated before. How come, with the importance of Barnabas as derived from the book of Acts, he disappears all of a sudden? No mention about him afterwards. There is no mention to him in any other canonical writings. Much later we hear of things that are attributed to him, but there is not much about him in the canonical writings. A second common objection is that the Gospel of Barnabas, in the Gospel of Barnabas, Barnabas claims that Jesus addressed him with that name, Barnabas. And some claim on the basis of the book of Acts that they say, no, this name was not given to Barnabas at the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. It was after the ascension of Jesus to heavens, and they say that the reason is that Barnabas actually means like the son of consolation or son of exhortation, because he sold his property after the ascension of Jesus, so they gave him that name. Now, in response to that, we can refer to a previous program where we made mention that some biblical scholars like Dahlman, Gray, and Deisman, Diessman, have chosen actually the meaning of Barnabas as son of Nebo, Nebo, and that it was mentioned also there that if we take the term son of encouragement as the meaning of Barnabas, it is actually a reference to his ability as a preacher, In fact, I checked an additional source also in the 11th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, published in 1910, volume 3, on page 407. In the commentary about the name itself, Barnabas, it talks first about how it was translated as son of consolation or son of exhortation. And then it adds, quote, but there is an initial difficulty about the Greek rendering itself, as no satisfactory etymology of Barnabas in this sense has as yet been suggested. This probably was an Aramaic word. So to say conclusively that the name Barnabas only means son of consolation and that only happened or was given to him after the ascension of Jesus is not a very powerful type of objection at all. In fact, there is no corroborating evidence to that effect at all. In the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, I'll just give that as a reference to the discussion of the origin of the term itself, on page 432. And also I noted that in the today's English version translation of the Bible, in the book of Acts, in chapter 4, verse 36, it says, and so it was Joseph, a Levite born in Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means one who encourages, sold a field he owned, brought the money, and turned it over to the apostles. Well, it's obvious from that translation that there is no implication that name was given to him after the ascension of Jesus. It simply says Joseph, a Levite, whom the disciple called Barnabas. And the name could conceivably have been given to him long time before the ascension of Jesus, and as such it vindicates his claims that Jesus addressed him actually in his the name that was known of him, and that is Barnabas.
I see. Were there any other objections that our viewers may want to hear about?
Yes, one of the main objections, for example, I've read about to the Gospel of Barnabas is that it says that in one place, and more than one place actually, Jesus, peace be upon him, denies that he was the Messiah. And again, I leave that word, we'll come to it. He denied that he was the Messiah. And then it says that is contradictory to what Barnabas himself says in the introduction of his Gospel, when he writes actually and says the true Gospel of Jesus called Christ. And they say that Barnabas, according to the book of Acts and according to historical information, knew Greek. He came from the island of Cyprus, so he knew Greek. And how could he make such a mistake? Because Messiah actually means Christus in Greek or Christ in English. So how come he calls him Christ in the beginning, and then in a later part he quotes Jesus as denying to be the Messiah? Along the same line also of the use of the term Messiah, he says that elsewhere in the Gospel it is indicated that the long-awaited Messiah, again quote unquote, is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he said that Muhammad was not known with that name Messiah at all, and never claimed to be a Messiah. Now, in response to that, I think it should be clarified that the term Messiah is used frequently in the Bible to refer not to one particular person or the long-awaited. Sometimes it refers to that, but it's not always used to refer to the one ultimate person to come, but rather to in the sense of someone who's anointed, chosen, or appointed in a given position. And there are several people who were described as messiahs in the Bible. For example, in the Psalms of David, in the second Psalm, verse 2, David is called Messiah. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 1, Cyrus is also called Messiah. There were lots of messiahs as far as the usage of the term, somebody who's appointed. And that's just similar to the term Mashiach in Hebrew or Masih in Arabic, somebody who's anointed or chosen. So that applies to any prophet. But on the other hand, we all know also that the term Messiah was known also in what you might call eschatological sense. That is a reference to a long-awaited personality to come. And we know that the Jews, for example, are still waiting for that Messiah. The Christian believe that ultimate Messiah was Jesus. Muslims believe that actually the ultimate person, ultimate Messiah in that global sense, who will have victory over evil and rule according to the will of God, has already come, and that's Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who is really the fulfillment of the anticipation of all of the prophets. So this is the term Messiah then is used in more than one sense, and we will see a little later that some of the discoveries in the Dead Sea Scrolls seems to indicate that there have been anticipation of two messiahs. So there's no difficulty actually with the usage of the symbol to have more than one meaning. But in addition to this, some people also raise objections in what they call perhaps internal evidence from within the gospel itself to try to discredit it as genuine.
Okay, maybe we'll pick up on the internal evidence that you just alluded to and talk about this type of objection.
Okay, for example, in some of the criticism directed at Barnabas is that it says that the writer could have not been a person who lived in Palestine. He doesn't know the geography of Palestine. What evidence they give? Well, they say in chapter 20, he describes how the seamen came to Nazareth and spoke about the miracles performed by Jesus, peace be upon him, while in the following chapter 21 in the Gospel of Barnabas, it says that Jesus went to Capernaum. And he said that that seems to indicate that the writer believed that Nazareth was a coastal city where the seamen came first, and Capernaum was an inland, which is the opposite, as he says. But this seemed to be like forcing a given meaning to what the Gospel of Barnabas says. Nowhere in chapter 20 and 21, and I checked them, does it say that Nazareth is a coastal city and Capernaum is an inland. That's one thing. Secondly, it is quite conceivable that people come through a coastal city like Capernaum, go to an important city first like Nazareth, and then in a later time, after a while, come back to Capernaum. There is no reason to not to accept this as a possibility of what happened. So to speak here about a conclusive evidence of geographical error does not seem to be really justified. Another aspect is that they say that by reading the Gospel of Barnabas, somewhere it describes the growth of fruits in the summer, especially in chapter 169. And they say that this is not a description which is befitting to Palestine. They tend to think of Palestine just as mostly desert and parched land. He said this description seemed to relate more to Spain or Italy. And they say not to Palestine. And this is a very strange objection, because Palestine, yes, there are desert areas, but there are places also where there are gardens. And it says that Jesus retired to the Garden of Gethsemane, for example. And definitely they were orchards, and Palestine has always been famous with fruits. Until now it's very famous, especially in citrus. Another objection internally is that they say that the writer of the Gospel of Barnabas seemed to be borrowing terminologies and expressions from Dante in his Divine Comedy. And they say that this actually is an evidence that the Gospel is not really an ancient one, but one that was written perhaps in the Middle Ages. They give examples of this, that he uses terms like false and lying gods, the circles of hell, the seven heavens, and terms like raging hunger. And they say these were expressions used by Dante. But again, the question here is this: how can we make sure that the opposite is not true? In other words, is it not possible that Dante's expressions were based on all the literature prior to the medieval times? Is it impossible even to assume that maybe Dante might have had access to the Gospel of Barnabas, and actually he was the one who adopted those expressions from Barnabas? We really don't know. We can't say for sure one way or the other, so we can't really say that this is an evidence that it was written in the medieval times. Sometimes people say no. Another internal problem is that when Jesus is quoted in the Gospel of Barnabas speaking about the Jubilee, a sort of Jewish celebration, he described that this happens every 100 years, and they say that this is erroneous, and that shows actually that the Gospel was written in the medieval times. But definitely, once you analyze that carefully, you will find that this is really a weak objection.
Now, you mentioned the Jubilee and the fact that it has been a source of criticism because that some of the facts may not be as accurate. Maybe you want to elaborate on this.
Okay, well, if you feel that, because it takes a little bit of explanation first to respond to that, but I think that perhaps will give you some background.
I just mentioned it because you mentioned that it is a source of objection.
Right, fair enough. Actually, once something is mentioned, maybe you should indicate or defend as to why it's strong or weak. The reason I believe it's weak is that, first of all, they say that in chapter 82 of the Gospel of Barnabas, as indicated earlier, it says that Jesus was talking to Barnabas describing or referring to the Jubilee, which comes every 100 years. And he said that this Jubilee will be reduced to an annual function when the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah, comes. Now, the critics of Gospel of Barnabas say that if you check the Old Testament, especially the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, it indicates that the Jubilee was to be celebrated by the Jews about every 50 years. Okay? And they say that the Catholics have adopted the same kind of practice. It's every 50 years. But in the reign of Pope Boniface, B-O-N-I-F-A-C-E, Boniface, who reigned between 1300 and 1343, he changed the Jubilee to once every 100 years instead of 50 years. But his successor changed it again to 50 years as it was in the Old Testament and in the Catholic practice. So they conclude, they say now this is definite proof that that gospel must have been written between 1300 and 1343. That's the time when that particular pope deviated from the practice of celebration of every 50 years and mentioned 100 years. Now, that kind of objection seemed to assume that the only period where there was deviation from this 50-year celebration was that period, 1300 to 1343. But otherwise, it has always been 100 years. Okay. Now, this kind of objection is very strange because some of the critics of the Gospel of Barnabas give a range of the date to prove that it was a forgery, and they say it was written perhaps between the 13th century to the 16th century. Now, these critics are contradicting each other, you see, because if it is written after 1343, there will be no reason to mention Jubilee every 100 years. And if it was written prior to 1300, obviously, again, there's no sense of it because the assumption they make is that it was always every 50 years, not 100 years. So that's one problem of inconsistency among the critics. But I think the most important response to that objection is that their assumption that the Jubilee was always celebrated every 50 years, that it never deviated except for that limited period at the time of Pope Boniface, is not correct. I make a reference here to an important work by James Hastings, H-A-S-T-I-N-G-S. It's called Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, published in 1914. And if you check under festivals and feasts, Hebrew, he says that the first thing that strikes us is that the law that regulates the celebration of the Jubilee, even though it appears in several places in the book of Leviticus, is believed by some of the biblical scholars to be later interpolations. Notice his word, that's not my word. Later interpolation. Let me get a direct quotation from that reference. He says, quote, "The law regulating this year are given in Leviticus chapter 25 verses 18 through 17 and verses 28 through 33, also chapter 27 verses 16 through 24. As, however, the first principal passage breaks the context. Notice here, the first principal passage breaks the context, and then he gives between brackets verses 1 through 7 and verses 18 through 22, dealing with the Sabbath year. It is probable that it is a later interpolation into the original law of Hebrews and should be regarded as belonging to the priestly code." Notice the final words he said, that this should be regarded as belonging to the priestly code, not necessarily the law that was given beforehand. It is quite possible then that the original celebration of the Jubilee was every 100 years, just as Barnabas quotes Jesus saying, and that the change from 100 years to 50 years in the book of Leviticus was a result actually of priestly interpretation or priestly code. In addition to this, we find that there is a great deal of uncertainty about the cycle for the celebration of the Jubilee, and that this uncertainty continued even after Jesus, peace be upon him. An example of this, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the 11th edition, volume 15, on page 534, it indicates that the change of the Jubilee to once every 50 years, instead of 100 years, by Pope Clement VI, was on the basis of the request of the Roman people. Request of the Roman people. Sorry, that changed from 50 years back to 100 years in 1343. And then it says that Pope Urban VI was in bad need of money, so he changed or reduced the intervals between the Jubilees to 33 years, beginning with 1389. And that Pope Paul II determined it as every 25 years, beginning with 1470. Now, with all of these changes in the past, changing according to the priestly codes, and present, it is not correct really to say that the only period in history where the Jubilee was changed was 1300 through 1343. This is not really necessarily borne by the facts available. We must add to that in conclusion that if the decision of Pope Boniface to use the 100 years as interval is not a decision that is supported by a written document, and my reference to that is a New Catholic Encyclopedia, published 67, volume 7, page 1141. The basic point we're saying here is that the objection to Barnabas on the basis of the cycle of the Jubilee is a very weak one. It does not prove in any way that the Gospel was written in the 14th century, but as we will see, it is much more ancient than that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Redaway. We'll pick up on this next week, inshallah. Your questions and comments will be most appreciated. Our phone number and address will be appearing on your screen. From all of us here in Islam in Focus, Assalamu alaikum. Hope to see you next week, inshallah.
أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول